Matthew 24. So good to see you here. We have a number of visitors this morning. We really want you to know we very much appreciate you being with us this morning on the Lord's Day and gathering with God's people to study and to sing praises to God and exalt His name. We've been studying through Matthew for quite a long time, 2 years now, and and now we're to chapter 24. This is a very difficult text for many, but I think it's helpful for us to think about a little bit of what it would be like. Imagine yourself being a Jew at the start of the first century. The temple is under construction. Your people have been prospering. Things have been going fairly well, even though you're under the reign of Rome. It's not 1 AD because they don't recognize the BC AD stuff yet. So it's just another time period like all the time periods before. But you're a Jew and you are worshiping God in Jerusalem. You're going to the temple. You're worshiping there. You're seeing the religious leaders, the Pharisees, the Sadducees. You see the Pharisees on a weekly basis on the Sabbath. They teach you from God's Word. And you grow up hearing all about how God is going to send His Messiah. And He's going to come and save you from the Roman oppression that you're under and establish the everlasting kingdom that was promised. And you'd be looking forward to that day and that Messiah coming. And maybe you've heard from other teachers that the Messiah's got to be near. There's got to be the Messiah because look at all these signs that seem to have been happening here recently. And then John the Baptist comes onto the scene. And he says, I'm preparing the way for the Messiah to come. And then imagine being one of the disciples who finds the Messiah. And gets to be in close with this Messiah. And now all you need is for the Messiah and everything you've learned in life to just fall into place and come together perfectly. But Jesus is not accepted by the religious people, the religious leaders. You believe firmly He's the Messiah, but everyone who is anyone doesn't believe it. They reject Him from being the Messiah. Imagine how heartbreaking that would be. And you're on your way to Jerusalem, and Jesus tells you, they're going to crucify me. I'm going up to Jerusalem now to die. And you go into the temple, and they're asking questions, and they're trying to trick Jesus, and Jesus says some really hard things to the religious leaders, condemning them for their hypocrisy. And you hear all of that. And this whole idea of your perfect meshing together of Messiah and the religious system of your day just seems to be crumbling apart. But you leave and you look up at the temple and you find hope in the beauty of this wonderful building and looking at the beautiful stones and how it has been established. And that is obviously a blessing from God, and you just think, oh, it's going to be okay. And you tell the Messiah, hey, Jesus, look at this beautiful temple and the beautiful stones. But He says, you see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. Imagine how devastating those words would be to you in your life. We studied last week about the disciples' response to Jesus' words of condemnation for the Jewish leaders, and also the words of His returning, and also the words that He spoke about the temple being destroyed. They ask 3 questions, and we'll start off reading verse 3 and seeing that again. It says, as He sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to Him privately, saying, tell us when these things will be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age. You see these questions coming out, and that end of age, the King James says end of the world, and that throws a lot of people off. But the word there is the same word for age, it's the same word for era. So it's, in other words, the end of the era. And it's an obvious reference to the destruction of the temple, which he just talked about. That's why they would ask that question. Not the end of the world, but end of the era, end of the age, end of the temple, end of the Jewish religion and the Jewish economy that has been set up. When is all of this going to take place is essentially the entirety of their question. You go to Gospels, Mark and Luke tell us one question, not three. When are all these things going to take place? When is Jerusalem going to be destroyed? And they want to know this information. Well, how does Jesus respond? Start reading in verse 4. And Jesus answered them, "See that no one leads you astray. For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains." So notice Jesus doesn't respond with the exact timeline in the start. Now we're going to read through a lot of chapter 24, and we're never really going to see an exact point in time. Oh, it's going to be 40 years from now. But you see him start off with warnings. In fact, we're going to see a lot of warnings this morning because Jesus is more concerned about what they're going to do in the future than he is about filling them in on the exact time when all these things are going to happen. He's worried about what's going to happen between now and that point. And he tells them other men are going to come in and they're going to call themselves the Christ. There were men before Jesus who called themselves the Messiah. We read about that in Acts. And whenever you look at history, you find in Josephus, he points out other men did come and they called themselves the Messiah, the Christ. And they got a following after them. And here's Jesus saying, other men are going to come and they're going to claim to be the Christ. Don't listen to them. Don't follow after them. And he says there's going to be all kinds of events that are going to happen. There's going to be wars. There's going to be rumors of wars. In fact, in Rome, there's tons of wars that take place in those 40 years. There's 3 civil wars that are going on at the same time, and another war that's happening also at the same time in Rome. So there's tons of wars happening at that time. And that instability in Rome is going to lead to the ousting of a dynasty and at 68 AD, right before the destruction. But there's going to be a ton of wars between the point of Jesus saying this and the point of the destruction of Jerusalem. And Jesus says, whenever you hear of the wars and the famines, there's going to be famines, and the earthquakes, there's going to be earthquakes. Pompeii, one of the earthquakes, a very widely known earthquake. There's going to be all these things that happen. And he says, people are going to rise up and they're going to try to lead you and they're going to say, this is it. Follow me now to be saved from what's about to happen. And Jesus says, don't listen to them. These are just the beginning of things. This is just the start leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, which I foretold. I love how he says, the beginning of the birth pains. Kind of fitting, right? But you think about a woman in labor, the beginning of the birth pains. It's not that the birth has happened yet, but it's starting. The labor process is starting. And that's what he wants them to see, is like, this is the indication. It is coming. It's not here yet, but it is coming. And we see in the New Testament multiple places where he says, no, don't think that Jesus has already came or that it's already happened because these events have happened. There's something bigger coming. And the bigger thing, of course, is the destruction of Jerusalem. So don't be deceived. He's trying to warn them. Imagine, if you will, military leaders rising up after Jesus, looking a lot like what they would think the Messiah would look like. Remember how Jesus doesn't look anything like the Messiah they're wanting? Imagine a military leader rising up looking like what they expect. And imagine the pull the disciples would have to follow after him and say, oh, I must have had Jesus wrong after a certain amount of time has gone by. And so Jesus is warning them at the very beginning and throughout this entire thing, don't fall for it. Don't fall for it. Then he tells them more information about what's going to happen in the future. Let's read verses 9 through 14. It says, Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. That sounds familiar. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. And the gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Notice the things that he says here resemble a lot of what he said earlier in chapter 23. He said he's going to send his disciples in 23:34. He's going to send prophets. He's going to send wise men. He's going to send scribes to those religious leaders. And some they're going to kill, and some they're going to crucify, and some they're going to flog in their synagogues. And here he says the same kind of thing. There's going to be tribulation. There's going to be suffering, and they're going to put you to death, and you're going to be hated. This is what's happening in the future. And he says because of that, some will fall away. Some will fall away. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be comfortable. And the tendency is going to be to go after somebody who tells you you don't have to suffer anymore, because it's going to be so bad. So these false prophets are going to arise and they're going to lead you astray. You don't like being hated by all the nations, and they're going to make it easier for you. Don't listen to them. Then he points out, because so many are going to fall away, there's going to be a betrayal. You're going to betray one another and hate one another. Disciples are going to betray disciples, and then they're going to hate one another. And there's going to be all this lawlessness, all this evil wickedness going on in the church, which shouldn't be. And he says, as a result of that, your love will grow cold. So you kind of have this double-edged sword that sweeps through the church. Lawlessness comes in, and people wanting to make life easier and give in to the false prophets. And then after those who are faithful see that, there's a tendency to let their heart grow cold. In other words, to stop loving those and hating them instead. And so he's pointing this out. This is going to happen in the future. You're going to have to deal with this, disciples. Between now and the time that the destruction happens, this is what you're going to go through. You go through the New Testament, we see this happen. John's gospel, John's letters, his epistles are full of those kind of warnings that there are false prophets and antichrists who are coming. And they have to deal with those things. And he tells them, the one who endures to the end will be saved. Notice the word end is brought up multiple times here. And the typical thing at the very end, notice, then the end will come. The typical thing is for people to struggle with, is this the end of time? Is this the end of the world? And maybe as you hear these words, the tendency is to apply them to ourselves directly, but remember the context, okay? Every time you read end, understand the questions the disciples have asked have nothing to do with the end of time. They're all about the end of the era. They're all about the destruction of Jerusalem. And he tells them, you have to endure to the end. You have to endure the tribulations. You have to endure the false prophets. But he also gives them good news. He says they'll be saved. And then he says the gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all the nations. And then the end will come. Even though there's false prophets, even though there's false messiahs, even though there is earthquakes and famines and wars, even though there's betrayal and lawlessness increasing, even though there's love growing cold, the gospel perseveres through all of that, and it makes its way to the end of the earth. We read about this in one of Paul's prison letters. Paul's in prison in the 60s A.D. Jerusalem's destroyed in 70 A.D. Listen to what Paul said. If indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, became a minister. Here he is in the 60s A.D., 30 years after Jesus says this, and he claims all creation has heard the gospel. And guess what happens? Jerusalem is later destroyed. So Jesus tells us exactly what's going to happen. He's talking to his disciples and letting them know there's going to be a lot of suffering, a lot of trials, a lot of false people popping up, but you have to endure. The gospel will go everywhere, and then the end will come. Then we get to the next section. Let's read it, verse 15 through 22. He says, "So, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant, and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved." All right, a few things to point out in this text. As you read through this, you get the sense that Jesus is now starting to go from warning to giving them some understanding of when these things will be. You know, the warning has told them all these warnings, all these things are going to happen before this happens. And then he tells them, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel. Isn't it interesting that we're studying Daniel on Wednesday nights? And many of you, we just read it last Wednesday night in Daniel chapter 9 about the 70 weeks vision. On the wings of abomination comes one who makes desolate. And that is specifically speaking about Rome coming to desolate Jerusalem. So what is this abomination that makes desolate? Abomination is a big word, right? Means something disgusting, something appalling. And desolation means destruction. Being made desolate is being made empty and destroyed. So what abomination makes it desolate? And what did Daniel foretell? Well, some people think that it's because it says here at the end, in standing in the holy place, that the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel is the period of time right before 70 A.D. when the Zealots came into Jerusalem and kind of took over, and they were actually occupying the temple. They actually took control of the temple, and they blocked it off, and they're not supposed to be in there. So some people think it's that, but what's most interesting to me is in Luke 21:20, when it talks about the abomination of desolation, it actually describes what it is. and it says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. So the surrounding of Jerusalem by armies is portrayed in Luke as being the abomination of desolation. So I don't know. It's not a big deal, really. But the picture is the disciples need to see and know that there's going to be some event that's going to be abominable, and it's going to tell you Jerusalem's about to be destroyed. And when that happens, get out. That's the sign that you need. You need to run. You need to, don't go back and take your stuff. You just need to get out of there. And whenever you read through about the destruction of Jerusalem and the surrounding of Jerusalem by Rome, they actually built a wall outside the city that completely surrounded the city to besiege the city. because people were getting out, and they decided to build that to stop them. They built it in 3 days. So it's a really terrifying time to be in the city, but a picture of get out before it's too late. It's the time, and he says at the end, there's going to be a great tribulation, but those days will also be cut short for the sake of the elect. What does that mean? It's not going to last forever. God is not going to end the world at that time, and he's not going to allow his people to be completely destroyed at that time. He's going to save them, and he's going to bring more people into the church and into his kingdom. So there's hope at the end of that section. You continue reading, verse 23, he says, "Then if anyone says to you, 'Look, here is the Christ,' or 'There he is,' do not believe it." Isn't that interesting? It's the third time we've read that there's going to be false people come up. "For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, 'Look, he's in the wilderness,' do not go out. If they say, 'Look, he's in the inner rooms,' do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Where the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other." Okay, a lot of information there. First of all, you have the repetition. Men are going to come claiming to be Christ. But he makes this statement, don't believe them, don't listen to them. I told you beforehand that these guys are going to come. Don't be deceived. He says, my coming will be obvious. And this is the way he says it. As lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. So whenever you look up in the sky, you see that lightning has struck. I mean, it's an obvious, everybody sees it. Unless you're inside in a dark room with no window. You know, oh, it's just lightning. Imagine how many hundreds of thousands of people see lightning happen at the same time, because it's just bright and it's in the sky and everybody sees it. And then he compares it also to a corpse being somewhere and buzzards or vultures overhead. How many thousands of people can tell there's a corpse there? And so a picture of whenever I'm here, everybody's going to know it. But wait a second. Are we talking about the end of the world again, right? I mean, this is the trouble that everybody has with this text. This is the complication of this text. Jesus talks about himself coming. And our immediate thought is second coming. Jesus has returned to take people up into heaven with him, and this is that event. But this whole thing's been talking about Jerusalem and talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And it's not talking about the second coming. It's talking about Jesus coming in judgment on Jerusalem using apocalyptic language. Okay, big word, right? Well, notice the apocalyptic language is here. The sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, the powers of the heaven will be shaken. This is the same terminology that's used in the Old Testament to say God is coming on this kingdom, on this nation, to wipe it out. It's lights out for this nation. He said the same thing whenever he judged Egypt, whenever he judges Babylon, whenever he judges Jerusalem the first time. He says these same kind of words. And they're not about the end of time. The time does not end when those nations are destroyed. It's an indication that God has come with the clouds to destroy a nation. So don't be deceived. Don't be misled by the many people who are trying to give you signs to say it's the end of time, like Jesus talked about right here in Matthew 24. He's not talking about the end of time. He's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, and he's talking about his second coming, like God did, talking about a coming, not the second coming, like God did in the Old Testament. We read Joel chapter 2 to set this up. And at the end, that was our scripture reading. And at the end of Joel chapter 2, verses 30 through 32, he says, I will show wonders in heavens and on the earth, blood and fire and columns of smoke. The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. And it shall come to pass that everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. Now listen to the rest of this, because this wasn't included in the Acts 2 text that we talked about in Bible class. He says, for in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem there shall be those who escape, as the Lord has said, and among the survivors shall be those whom the Lord calls. Okay? So the day of the Lord that's talked about in Acts 2, the day of the Lord that's talked about in Joel, is about the destruction of Jerusalem. That's what it's about. That's what it's pointing to. It's a judgment against Jerusalem. So you read all this, and it's kind of complicated and hard to understand, but it's really not that bad. It's just a picture of Jesus coming in judgment against Jerusalem, just like God foretold in the Old Testament would happen, because they murdered the Messiah and they rebelled against him. Just like Jesus said back in chapter 23, you will be judged, you will be sentenced to hell, and then your house is left you desolate, and then there will not be one stone left upon another. Okay? All right. A lot of information. We're going to stop our reading there in Matthew 24 and continue to look at this, beginning in verse 32. So we'll study from 32 to the end and look at what else Jesus has to say to his disciples. But up until this point, I really want you to understand a few things. The disciples are going to face a very turbulent future. That's what Jesus tells them. It's not the end of the world. That's not what he's talking about, but it is the end of their world. They're Jews, okay? Jesus was a Jew. It's the end of the era. It's the end of a time when the Jews had a place to call their city, where God dwells, where God lives with them, and they go to worship. It's all going to come crashing down to an end. But Jesus also comforts them and tells them he will save those who endure and those who remain faithful throughout all the trials and all the temptations to go after false teachers and false prophets. Okay? So that's the lessons that we learn from this text. Now, how do we apply this to ourselves? The tendency is to read it as though Jesus is speaking directly to us. That's a very, very common thing that we might do, because he's speaking to his disciples and we're his disciples, but we're not living at the same time. So the context needs to be considered before we make application. Jesus is speaking to his disciples about an event that they will experience in their lifetime, if they live that long. But we, as we look at it, we don't want to apply that text prematurely, as though they're spoken to us about the end of the world. Okay? That's not what he's talking about. There are texts that talk about his second coming that I think we are perfectly fine applying to ourselves and looking at. I don't think this is one of them. But there is an application for us. In the same sense that the disciples are faced with men who would teach things that are false, we are faced with the same thing. We are faced with those who come in and tell us it's the end of time, just like Jesus said. Look at all these wars. Look at COVID, the pestilence. Look at, there's a famine here. Look at all this tribulation that people over in this part of the world are experiencing. And look at all these wars that are breaking out. And it's the end of time, just like Jesus said. And no, don't be led astray by that. It's not what Jesus was talking about. He's talking about the end of Jerusalem. And we can get led astray by that stuff as well. Don't let it lead you astray. Don't follow those who are teaching those things. Stay focused on what is true and found in the Word. Because if we let that stuff lead us astray, then life may become more difficult than it needs to be. And it's already hard enough because we do deal with tribulations and trials, not on the level of the disciples, but we do deal with those. Another application that I think we can take away from this is whenever we go through those trials, they're nothing like what those disciples went through. Whatever our trials are, they pale in comparison to being crucified, to being killed, and hated the way they were hated. We live in a very, very blessed time right now. And as bad as the world is getting, it ain't nowhere near the time when Rome ruled the earth and Christianity was just starting off. So instead of woe is me and pitying ourselves, we need to expect life to be difficult and just be grateful that it's not as difficult as they had it. To endure whatever trials and temptations come upon us, whatever suffering we have to endure, because today's Christianity is a very soft and weak Christianity. And we don't know what's coming, but it doesn't look like it's going to be easier than what we've had in the past. So we really need to accept the fact that struggle and trial are a part of life. And it's okay. And I think as we see the disciples being told, lawlessness will increase and people will betray one another. And as a result of that, the love of many will grow cold. I think we can really learn an important lesson from that as well. How many times have we seen people fall away from the faith? Led astray by the world, led astray by some false teacher. We've seen lawlessness increase. We've seen adulteries. We've seen robberies. And we've seen all kinds of evil things happening. And our tendency is to stop loving people, to stop trusting people. Because if we do that, if we trust people, they'll break our hearts. But Jesus has called us to a life of holiness and a life of love. And if we neglect either one of those, we're failing to be faithful to the calling we've received. We can't let go of either one. This is what he wants his disciples to do, and how amazing is it that we see Paul preaching and doing all that right up to the very end. We see other Christians throughout the New Testament faithful to the very end. In the midst of tremendous trial and suffering, they don't let their love grow cold. They love with all their heart, even though it's hurt them so many times in the past. They've been betrayed. They've been left out in the cold. And they still love the brethren and want them to succeed. We need that kind of love in ourselves. No matter what comes, we need to love one another. And we need to love all those outside, those who are not of us, and bring them in. Don't be afraid of lawlessness and all that kind of stuff. Hit it head on and show people love. Teach them the truth. Because the most wonderful thing about this is, Jesus said, the gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world. In a time of great lawlessness, in a time of great trial, in a time of great tribulation, the gospel spreads. Believe that it can happen today. And don't tell yourself just because the world's so bad that there's no chance that I can spread the gospel to anybody. Well, they did it in a way worse time than we live in. And in fact, the tribulation seems to only make the gospel spread more. So believe that. If you're here today and you've not received the blessing that God wants to give you of forgiveness of sins, you've seen how Jesus has revealed beforehand the destruction of Jerusalem and all these kind of future events, you know he's the Messiah. You know you should worship and serve him, that he's the one in control, and that he's going to come again, and he's going to bring you to judgment before your God, and you're going to have to give an account. Do you have faith that Jesus is going to save you because you understand the salvation he offers and you've accepted it? He wants you to change. He wants you to accept it. He wants you to submit to his will and to put on Christ and to receive the love that he offers you. The blood of Jesus can wash away all your sins if you will just make that decision and submit your life to Christ. If we can help you in any way, please come as we stand and sing.